Well, hello everyone, and I'm so excited because my guest today is Elijah Manning. And Elijah Manning is a consultant and started his own business. He is concerned about what's going on in our world right now with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and has started his own little business called Inclusive Education LLC. He grew up in Old Saybrook, currently lives in Norwich, so drove all the way down to the studio to be with us today. And I'm so excited to welcome you, Elijah. Welcome, and thank you for being on my show.
I appreciate you having me here, and it was worth the drive.
Oh, I hope so. You're saying that prematurely, so.
It's never premature when somebody's willing to have the conversation.
Oh, so. Deep. Yeah, you're deep already. Okay, let's dive deeper.
Absolutely.
So we're talking about equity and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So first of all, do you have a little pat definition that you like to use when we talk about equity? What do you think of when you think of equity? People don't even know what that means.
No. So there's always equitable circumstances can ebb and flow, and it's always, people always think of it as the end all to get rid of any barriers that we may have. And it's not quite that. It is the ability to all have what we need necessary to get over the barriers. But that is just the start of it, because then the next step will be justice, which is removing the barrier in general. So equitable is a good place to start, so you can move further.
So if I'm having a heart attack, you would call an ambulance for me and not worry about calling an ambulance for everybody else in the room. That would be an example of equity. Is that correct?
Kind of.
Tell me.
Kind of. So you are calling it, but it's equitable, like calling it for everybody, but the justice in that case, if you're looking for that step further. So the equitable would be to make sure everybody gets that, but the justice would then be the barriers in healthcare, the barriers in all those other circumstances that come along with what is preventing this from being a moment where everybody has the justice of being served properly. So the equitable one is to make sure everybody has a chance, but there may be some who have a greater chance based off of, in this case, we're talking more color or whatever the case may be.
So pre-existing conditions, perhaps, and perhaps it's the color of your skin or even the color of your eyes, the color of your hair, your height, your weight. Like we are such a, what is the word? Society based on appearance, and we judge people so quickly according to that. So I like to think of equity, which I think is a really easy way to look at it, is 3 kids lined up to see a baseball game. There's one that's tall, there's one that's short, and there's one that's tiny. So they're all looking over. It would be inequality because they can't all see, right? So then it would be equitable to allow for the littlest one to have a ladder that goes up so he can see over the top, maybe a step stool or a stool so that the middle one can see over the top, and the tall kid didn't need anything. So you absolutely give them what they need.
Exactly.
And then where would the justice come in for that?
Removing the fence.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah, because that's the thing that is causing the need for the equitable. So if you remove the systemic barrier, then we're all on that same playing field.
Love it. Very good. Okay. So that's really an interesting experience. I mean, just kind of getting to the baseball field, because you think of, this is a little bird walk, but you think of baseball as something that it's a family sport, it's an American sport, right? We all love baseball. Like Jackie Robinson, what a player. Like we have good history with that. But how can you afford it?
Yeah. So the interesting thing right now with baseball is they're having that exact discussion on how they can get baseball back into inner cities, for that matter. And they have initiatives going where they're going into the cities to try to bring the equipment or just a baseball glove, which has now become not as popular in fashion because it's easier to have like one basketball and go to the court than it is to everybody have a glove or a bat, those kind of things. So there's an initiative by the MLB to work harder to get it to everyone in the inner city specifically, because that's typically the area, not solely, but that's typically the areas where they have less interest in baseball at that point, and it's probably due in part to a lot of those, there's nowhere to play.
They don't have a bat, they don't have a ball, and they don't have a glove, and those are the three essential objects, right? Yeah. And I remember friends telling me they had a stick ball and they didn't have a glove, or I don't know what they used for a ball. They must have had something, but yeah, exactly. So good point. But you grew up in Old Saybrook, and I thought you made an interesting comment when I was speaking to you earlier about you learned about differences and experiences that were unique to you that you didn't understand until you got to know more.
Right.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, so, my family, the Manning family, has been around in the Old Saybrook area for generations. I actually just recently had a conversation with my aunt, and she is well known in that town, Mrs. Fontes, who worked at the Goodwin School for many years.
Was she the secretary?
She was.
I worked with her.
Yeah, she's my aunt.
Oh my gosh, I loved her. What was her first name?
Yvonne. Well, Lolita is what she goes by.
Well, we
Yvonne
called her
Lolita
Yvonne
Fontes.
at school. Yeah.
But I call her Aunt Leedy.
Of course. Yeah. I knew her. Yeah, she was lovely.
Yeah, everybody always loved her.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, she's an incredible person.
But you don't cross her.
No, you don't. So luckily I don't have to deal with that. She loves me a little extra, so I have a little extra leeway because being family.
So Yvonne and the Mannings, I actually worked with your auntie.
Yeah. So they've been in the Old Saybrook area for generations since the early 1900s, 1930s is I think when they bought the farm. Could have that wrong. I have it in my notes somewhere. But nonetheless, so they've been in that area for a long time, and the Manning family has just been there ever since, but there's not as much diversity in Old Saybrook as there was when they were there initially. It has become less diverse, which is another issue that my mother and I talked about at another point with kind of the redlining issue of Old Saybrook and things of that nature. But nonetheless, I was one of a few other black kids in school, and I'm mixed, so I'm not as dark as some of the others, and I still, as my cousin always put it, people look at me and they won't see me as a white person. They just won't. I don't look like a white person. I look something. Is what I always get. Well,
you're intriguing. Is my comment to that, and charming to that effect, right?
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
So it made me have different experiences that I don't think I ever took into account until I started to understand, like, that it was because I looked a little different. And there weren't many. There's only a couple real incidents that really dug deep, and I knew in those moments something was wrong. And as I look back at them now, I'm like, man, that wasn't the only one.
Did you report?
I didn't. There was a policing issue that I didn't report. And, recently I had a conversation with my aunt, and she's like, why didn't you tell me? She's like, I would have been in there in a heartbeat to report it.
She would have.
I know she would have. And I was in a moment where I was in more of like a disgusted shock, and I just didn't want to deal with it.
I get it. I get it.
I
get it. And it's humbling, and it's a little bit scary, and you don't really process it. But that's one of the things that's not uncommon.
Right.
Yeah, and I don't know, how many others were there who are people of color, or did you have some?
Yeah, there's my best friend is a black man as well, and he had some experiences both in Old Saybrook and nearby towns. There was a specific incident that happened with him in Westbrook, and he fit the bill as a black man because they were in search of a black man, and he had nothing to do with it. And he was even, like, the police were even told at that moment he had nothing to do with it by somebody who he was actually with, and that didn't matter. So it was this, no matter what, he's guilty. I thought it was supposed to be innocent until proven guilty, but in that moment he was guilty until proven innocent. And yeah, so, you know, those types of experiences, the older we got and the more we talked about them with each other, the more I was like, yeah, you weren't alone in this one. And, you know, mine wasn't quite as severe, but, you know, I had some issues of my own. And there was a big issue that I had when I was younger that both him and I were actually involved with. And that is a much deeper issue. And if you want to go deep, I'll tell you about that. But if you don't want to, if you were trying to keep it a little bit softer.
Your choice.
All right, so when I was about 12 years old, it was maybe 11, somewhere in that area. I was at the town green. They used to have
in Old Saybrook.
The town green. They used to have concerts.
I'm trying to think where that is.
So it's right next to the old town hall where the Cate is.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's the
now
town
I know
green.
where I am. Okay. I'm real visual. So.
My wife is the same way.
Yeah.
So they used to have concerts every summer.
Sure.
And happened to be my parents weren't there. But myself, my brothers were, I have two older brothers, younger sisters as well. But it was me and my older brothers were there, and my friend, we were hanging out. And there was this, me and my friend were hanging, and there was this white kid who started calling us dirty because our skin was brown. So, you know, we were like, this is ridiculous, get out of here. My friend threw a little sand on him and said, now you're dirty too. Well, next thing I know is I'm being tackled. As an 11-year-old young man by this guy's father.
Oh, gee.
Right. I was tackled to the ground, pinned down, smacked in my face repeatedly.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. And for years I didn't really talk about this story, but I'm at the point where I think I need to talk about this story. And so it doesn't happen to other people. But there were adults around. Nobody stopped this man from beating up this young
11-year-old kid
of color. And my friend was there as well. He got pushed to the side because I guess somehow he thought it was me that threw sand on his child. And I'll take the spot for my friend anytime because I don't wish that upon him.
Right.
That's not the issue.
Right.
But it took there were a bunch of other teenagers who were there who eventually pulled the man off of me. And eventually, you know, I got up and I didn't know what was happening. I was in complete shock.
Well, you've been slapped around a little bit.
Yeah. You know, he was as hard as he could in my face, and I could still remember how it felt. But my brothers finally came. They didn't know. They're like, what happened? We called my parents. They came down. We called the police. There are certain things I remember afterwards. Like I remember being in the police station. I remember them trying to calm my father down because at that point he's the angry black man, and they're like, we need you to calm down, sir, even though it was just his son that was abused, you know, physically in the middle of a public space.
It's horrible. Yeah.
And then the man, he ended up, you know, getting in some trouble, and he had to write a letter to my family and to me apologizing. But in his letter, he wrote, I'm only apologizing because I have to.
So disingenuous, yeah.
Right. And that was my justice system that I lived through.
And you're only 11. So I'm thinking like an 11-year-old is in what, 5th grade, maybe, something like that. So you're still in elementary school, maybe getting ready to go off to middle school.
Right.
Wow, that's so young to have that experience. Yeah. And what about, like, you didn't even throw the sand, your friend threw the sand. And what happened to the kid that that your friend threw the sand at?
I don't even know.
Yeah.
It like left, and I don't know. And it's, you know, something that my mother has had a hard time talking about. And I mean, I completely understand why. I have children, and I couldn't imagine, and I wouldn't want to have to relive that for them because it would irk me so much each time I had to think about it. So I never really looked into what happened to the son, but I know the family later on and things, so it's interesting in that way.
So you've kind of followed the family to know what maybe happened down the road with them.
Right.
Which is extraneous. I mean, my daughter got beat up by a babysitter when we were living up in Vermont at the time, and that was a horrible experience. And as the mom, I was really traumatized by it. And then it turned out that the police did an investigation on us, so very interesting how that all works out. But we heal, right? We heal from these experiences, and you need to. I hope your mom can heal, because there's nothing worse than having your baby. Their hearts are beating, or your heart is beating outside of your body when you have a kid.
Yeah.
So, and you know that having two and then one on the way, which is pretty amazing. So. I want to be a help. How can I help? How can I be an ally? What are some things like me, Cate Steel, I live in East Lyme. What are some things I can do? What can you tell me? What's some advice you have for me?
Absolutely. So allyship is always one of the most interesting things that people talk about, because to be an ally doesn't mean you have to be a friend of somebody. All right. So people often think of it as like, well, I'm their friend. That means I got their back. But that's not what an ally is. An ally doesn't have to be anybody who you're friendly with. It has to be somebody that has the best interest of you as a human being on your side.
Right.
So, for instance, if you were to see something happening with somebody else, whether it be like racial slurs being tossed at somebody, you as an ally may be putting yourself in a bit of an uncomfortable situation by helping to speak up. So that's like an extreme version of allyship, but an important one nonetheless, being somebody who somebody else can count on for you to have their back, even if you don't know them, maybe you can cross paths before. But that's not the only issue.
Okay.
Continuing in your community to have conversations, continuing your learning on what DEI work is, what other isms are, like there's the fight over CRT right now.
Critical race theory.
Exactly, and it's good that you know that. and I don't know if you can define critical race theory versus DEI. I'm hoping you can. I'm going to guess you can, but I will assume in this instance.
Right.
But there are a lot of people who don't, and like if you want to be a true ally, you have to know differences between things like that. You also have to not say things like, I don't see color,
right?
Because those are ways of knocking down all the work that has been being built up to accept differences. So being an ally is important keys to allowing growth, change, education, renewal, teaching, learning. All of that are key steps in being an ally. I've worked with some schools, and I always do. There's a little commitment that I always like to tell people to have, and it's like the who, what, why, where questions. Who is this to me? How can I help?
So,
what can I do?
Okay, so put me in a situation.
All right, so...
maybe at the grocery store. I love improv, by the way.
Yeah, okay, me too. Me too.
So I'm in the grocery store. Yeah. What am I seeing?
So you're seeing a person who of color who is now being followed around in the store by security.
Okay.
How can you help as an ally?
Maybe tell me if this is the right thing or wrong thing to do, because I want to learn in this process too. I would maybe go up to him and just say, hey, how you doing today? Like, be a friendly person, like, thing's okay, and maybe just give him a heads up, perhaps, that, it looks like, there's some eyes kind of watching here. Right. Or, I don't know, is that?
Sure, that's absolutely one way. There's nothing wrong with that way as well. There's also, if you are a little more bold and brave, asking security.
I would kind of thought about that. Like, but then I don't want to be,
So that's the thing with allyship. There's an uncomfortable line. And which part of it are you willing to cross? So you're willing to possibly help out the individual, which is awesome allyship as well. So there's no wrong answer. And I know you said you're worried about teaching the wrong answer, but there's not a wrong answer. Because that's helpful as well. Giving them a heads up or just treating them like a human being may make security see them as a human being. Maybe it suddenly changes security's perspective and they're not a threat anymore.
I think I'd almost be tempted to be like, hey, I think I know you. Have I met you before?
Right, absolutely. You love improv, right?
What are you doing here? Did you see the bananas are on sale? Like,
exactly. There's moments of improv that you can have in your own life. And people often worry about putting themselves in a harmful or stressful situation. And that is absolutely something that you need to be aware of. Mm-hmm. But remember, the person who you're being an ally to might be in that same position without even knowing it. Or they might know it. They might know that security's following them. And how are they going to feel about that? And then having somebody come up to them and talk to them about it, or in a more approachable manner, may help to ease that stress of them and know that that's that person's issue, the security guard's issue. But I'm still an accepted person within this setting. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, and that changes people's perspective. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So that's an important thing.
Absolutely. Well, good one. Good improv. So, yeah, no, I could see myself in the store and seeing this. Did we say guy? I just imagined this guy.
I think we did, but
yeah, it doesn't really matter.
Right.
So continue that work. And I had a conversation with a woman, Martha Braxton, I believe is her name. She is the supervisor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at CADE, the Connecticut Association for Board of Education. So we have all of these little acronyms. And she told me, Cate, do your homework. She said, Cate, do your homework. And so I've started to read some books like Ain't I a Woman and How to Be Sisters and that kind of thing. So really trying to read some books. Went to the book barn and blew $20, just getting these things and understanding what it felt like, or what it might have felt like, or at least hearing it from first-person perspective. Right. So trying to do some of that work. So back to you, though, Elijah. You work in school systems. What else do you do?
So I also work with communities. So I've worked with, been in conversation with some Board of Educations. I've worked with some libraries and some youth and family services. So I've done a couple workshops. Oh, and also Camp Hazen as well. I've done a couple workshops
Campaigns?
on Camp Hazen.
Camp Hazen. I don't know about Camp Hazen.
Yeah, I forgot to tell you that.
Hazen?
Yeah, that's the camp in Deep River.
Okay.
And it's the summer camp. So
nice.
I've done some implicit bias workshops and cultural humility workshops. And those are important conversations to have when you're first really starting to be aware of racism and how to become anti-racist, which are two different things. You know, I'm not racist versus I'm anti-racist are two different conversations. So having those conversations, a couple of them unfortunately had to do through Zoom.
In person is so much better, right?
It is.
Yeah.
And I was able to do the Camp Hazen one in person. And I was able to work with Old Saybrook School in person once as well, which was very satisfying and it's a much richer experience because a screen always separates you a little bit, but when you get to be in the room with somebody, you get to feel their energies and feel how they're responding to what you're saying differently than just reading it or seeing it through a screen, I should say.
Yeah. So, that's really important work. So when we're talking about educational equity, I know that there has been some discussion about identification for people or people of color. So, and where we sometimes will say that they have special education needs. And how can we help with that? Because people don't understand that happens. How do we help with that?
So specifically, I'm sorry, repeat exactly what you're saying.
So people of color are over-identified or identified more frequently as having perhaps a learning disability. Right. And I think that there are different learning styles. And I think like Gardner talks about different intelligences. Can you speak to that a little bit about learning styles? And
yes.
Because you're obviously genius.
Well, I would never go that far, but
talented,
thank you.
bright, you know.
I learn a lot, so I'm constantly reading and trying to develop more. So there's a wonderful idea of how people learn. Okay. And we all learn differently, whether it be kinesthetically, visually, like you were saying, you're visual, just by repetition and things of that nature. But there's also, the issue becomes testing and it becomes subject matter. So there's, in a lot of our curricula throughout the country, there is a sanitized, also known as a whitewashed version of things, right? So that becomes a lot of detachment for people of color because they're looked at as, well, we learned about slaves. If you're a black person, for instance, we learned about slaves, my people were slaves.
Period.
Then they had Harriet Tubman, they weren't slaves. There was Frederick Douglass, he spoke against slavery. And then there was Martin Luther King, and there was segregation, and then they tried to not have it, and then he got killed. So it's like there's very specific things that you learn, but there's so much more that you don't learn. So you become detached from information because it's like, I only get to learn specific pieces of my rich history. Again, speaking as somebody, a black individual, but that's not alone. If you're looking at indigenous, it's like, you learn the Trail of Tears, but you don't learn the rich history before. You just learn Christopher Columbus came and he settled America, but that's not the truth of it all. So a lot of these individuals have a slight detachment. And then if you go into testing, there's also, before we get to testing, there's also a lack of diversity in teaching.
Right.
And there's been studies that have been done that, say people of color, they use a lot of women, black women specifically in this study, but a lot of black women as teachers help not just the black students, but help all students to learn greater. Right. So they literally have done studies. I have a list of some of these studies, and that is a key thing that people don't recognize, that it's not just for the black students so that they can learn, it's for all the students. Diversity is incredible for all people because you get to learn a much more well-rounded idea of things.
I love that.
And there's also the history of testing, like the SAT specifically. Like in affluent communities, it's much easier for them to get tutors so that they can accomplish an SAT.
Well, even the test questions, because I was a speech pathologist by training, and I grew up in Nebraska. So you have a picture of a shoreline. Well, we don't have too many shorelines in Omaha, Nebraska. We have the Missouri River, and it's mostly boats. You don't go on it. So there's not a shore. There's not a beach. So just for instance, I mean, that would be a bias against anybody from the Midwest. I mean, not that it's the same kind of extent, but I understand exactly what you're saying. So you're going to think that somebody who doesn't have this East or West Coast experience, or south along the Texas or Florida, whatever, to not have that. So I understand exactly what you're saying with that.
So the teaching just we need to find a way to teach more, and that's part of my whole idea of inclusive education.
I love that.
To give us a more well-rounded curricula so that we're not just pigeonholed into learning the same systemic learning that we have been.
Well, and then to me, it's almost like going on a trip without going someplace. And it's almost like an exotic trip, like, oh my gosh, we get to go to Europe or Asia or whatever. But we only have a minute left, and I know that you have something that you want us to sign off on or pledge to do. So
so the commitment.
The commitment, that's the word,
No,
commitment.
There it is. I lost it for a second, but I found it. So the commitment to future work. How will you go forward with what you have learned? So there's the who, what, why, and where.
Okay.
What are ways you can use this knowledge?
Okay.
That's a big one. Number 2, why is this important?
I think we all grow from it. Yeah, I think we all grow from it.
I agree.
Yeah.
3, where can you use this knowledge? That comes to what we were talking about.
Wherever I go, wherever I see somebody.
Who can use it?
Everybody, right? Yeah, it's pretty universal.
That's what I think too. When is it appropriate to use?
Whenever you see it, right?
And how will you continue to use?
As carefully and gently as possible, right? Because I think it's old people. I think it's people of different colors. I think it's people who are LGBTQIA. I think it's, veterans, anybody who needs a leg up, right?
Right,
yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I speak from one aspect of diversity, but I'm not the only need for diversity.
No.
There's so much more, and I want to be able to teach all of those as well.
Well, thank you for your work.
Thank you for having me.